corporate strategy is a strategy that firms use to compete across multiple businesses. It's relevant for two groups of firms. First, for multi-business firms, but also for single business firms that are thinking of expanding into a new business, after which they would become a multi-business firm. What are those multi-business firms now? Let's look at some examples. The first example is Berkshire Hathaway, which is run by Warren Buffett, who you may know. What's interesting about this company is that it's active in multiple businesses. I've shown you here three. The first one is diamonds. So you can go to Berkshire Hathaway to buy a diamond ring. You can also buy tomato ketchup from them. And lastly, you can even rent an airplane from them. The next example is LVMH, which is originally a French company. Again, this company is active in multiple businesses. The first picture shows some of their watches that they're selling. They also sell fashionable handbags. The brand you may know is Louis Vuitton, and the LV in LVMH actually stands for Louis Vuitton. And lastly, they also sell champagne. The brand here is Moet & Chandon, and the M in LVMH stands for Moet. The third example is Samsung from Korea. One of its businesses that it's active in is medical equipment. The next business, which is very different, is mobile phone devices. And it could be that you're watching this video from a Samsung device. And the last business that I want to highlight is heavy-duty cranes. So they actually produce these cranes that are used in harbors to lift heavy cargo. The key point here is that it's one firm, but they're active in multiple businesses, and those businesses might be quite different from each other. So as examples, I picked some of the world's biggest multi-business firms. But of course, many other multi-business firms are much smaller. But why should any of these firms have a corporate strategy? Wouldn't it be sufficient for them to have different strategies for each business? Let's think about Samsung. Wouldn't it be sufficient for them to have just one strategy for its medical devices, another strategy for its mobile phone business, and yet a third strategy for its heavy cranes business? Why would they need a corporate strategy? Here's a question for you. Does the performance of a business vary more by its industry or by its corporation? Let's think about Samsung's business, and in particular, the mobile phone business. Let's say we have earnings figures over the last 10 years. Naturally, these earnings figures are going to go up and down. They will vary over time. But will they vary more by its industry, that is, other mobile phone businesses not part of Samsung, or will they vary more by the corporation? That is, will they vary more by the performance of other businesses within Samsung, but not in mobile phone business? What do you think? This is a difficult question to answer without data. I've just published a study for which I had access to lots of data. I had access to the research done on this topic for the last 20 years. And it's a meta-analysis, which means it's a study of studies. So it aggregates the findings of thousands of industries and thousands of corporations. And the results are clear. Industry and corporation both matter, but corporation matters even more. Let's look at the results. Here are the results. What you see on the vertical axis is the explained variance in performance of a business. And then what is shown, how much each of these factors accounts for that variance. So what you can see is that industry in total accounts for 8% of that variance, whereas corporation does so even more, 14% in total. What does it mean for us? Well, if we want our businesses to do well, it means that we should consider the corporation's perspective, and in particular, its corporate strategy. Let's look a bit in more detail what corporate strategy is. What's the corporate strategy of your company? That is not an easy question to answer. And one reason that it's not easy to answer is that people define corporate strategy in many, many different ways. So it's clear we need a common definition. I define corporate strategy based on its key decisions. If corporate strategy is about competing across multiple businesses, then there's really two things that we should care about. The first is portfolio selection. The second is portfolio organization. Let's discuss them in turn. Portfolio selection is deciding on which businesses to be active in. For example, we could be active currently in 3 businesses. The question is, why are we active in these 3 businesses? Should we enter a 4th business, and why that business? Or perhaps maybe we should exit from one of our businesses. So portfolio selection is really thinking about which businesses should we be in and why. The other key decision that we need to think about is portfolio organization. That is, once we have our set of businesses, how should we organize to create value across these businesses? And an important element there is organizational design. Which businesses go together in the different divisions and the different units? So we could think about an organizational structure that sits on top of these businesses. Another important element of portfolio organization is the role of corporate headquarters. We can define corporate strategy as choosing 1. Portfolio selection, 2. Portfolio organization. The next time someone asks, what is your corporate strategy? Now you know that you need to provide answers to 2 questions. First, which business are you in and why? And second, how are you organized across these businesses? So we've seen what corporate strategy is. One way to deepen our understanding of corporate strategy is to compare it with business strategy. Here is our earlier example of LVMH. Business strategy is at the level of the business. Corporate strategy is at the level of the corporation. So then one difference between corporate and business strategy is that business strategy is about a single business, corporate strategy is about multiple businesses. So LVMH would have one business strategy for its champagnes, it would have a different business strategy for its handbags, and yet another business strategy for its watches. But it would have one corporate strategy that cuts across all these businesses. Thus, business strategy is about a single business, corporate strategy is about multiple businesses. This, of course, raises the question, what is a business and how can we differentiate one business from another? Here's one way. We can describe a business as follows. Who are the customers? What are we selling? How are we producing and distributing what we're making to the customers? The who, what, how. So here you see a picture of a bank branch, and the bank is called HSBC. I actually took it myself in our building that I'm sitting in right now. If we think about the who, what, how, we can say, who are the customers of this branch? So who would be the retail customers within the UK? What are they selling? So one thing that they're selling us is current accounts. You can make payments from your accounts. How are they doing that? Well, an important element of that is their branches, which they situate near their customers. We can describe this business along its 3 dimensions: who, what, how. We say that 2 businesses differ if they differ on at least one of these dimensions. Here's an example. The top picture shows another HSBC branch, but this one is not in the UK, it's actually in Malaysia. So if we think about 2 different businesses, we would say these businesses differ because the who is different. In the previous example, the who was retail customers within the UK, and clearly this branch or this business is not focused on retail customers in the UK. We can also think about the different business by changing the what. So HSBC doesn't just offer current accounts, they also offer mortgages. So again, we would say that the mortgage business is different from the earlier business because of a different what, a different product. And lastly, we can also change the business by changing the how. The earlier example relied on physical branches nearly located to its customers. Turns out that HSBC also has an online-only bank, which is called First Direct. It doesn't use physical branches. You can only access your current account through the internet. So again, a different business because a dimension differs relative to the previous example. Hence, one difference between business and corporate strategy is the number of businesses. In business strategy, we're talking about a single business. In corporate strategy, we're talking about multiple businesses. And we have seen that we can differentiate businesses from each other along the who, what, how dimensions. Now, if corporate strategy is in part deciding about which businesses to be in, the implication is for us that we need to analyze businesses along these three dimensions: who, what, how. So we're comparing corporate strategy with business strategy. We've seen one difference: the number of businesses. Business strategy is about a single business. Corporate strategy is about multiple businesses. Now we're going to look at a second difference: the goal. The goal of business strategy is often seen as maximizing competitive advantage. Competitive advantage is often defined as the difference between willingness to pay and the willingness to supply. Let me explain each of these terms in turn. Willingness to pay is the maximum buyers are willing to pay for your product. Let's look at this Honda car example. Let's say our willingness to pay for this car is 20,000. That means if the price is 25,000, which is more than 20,000, we would not buy this car. On the other hand, if the price is 15,000, which means it's below our willingness to pay, we would buy this car. Now we can compare the willingness to pay of this Honda car with another car. I'm showing you here a Tesla car, and let's say our willingness to pay is higher for the Tesla car than a Honda car, which means we prefer the Tesla car over the Honda car. So we can say that the Tesla car has a willingness to pay advantage over the Honda car because we are willing to pay more for the Tesla than for the Honda. But willingness to pay is only half the story. The other story is willingness to supply. Willingness to supply is the flip side of willingness to pay. Willingness to supply is the minimum for which the suppliers are willing to provide you all the inputs. So let's say the willingness to supply for this Honda car is 10,000. That means if as a Honda you offer $10,000 to your suppliers, they would be willing to provide you all the inputs. If you're only offering them 8,000, they will not provide you the inputs. In contrast, if you would provide 12,000, which is more than their willingness to supply, they would supply you all the inputs. Now, just as we can think about a willingness to pay advantage, we can also think about a willingness to supply advantage. Let's compare it with a Skoda car. And let's assume that they designed the car such that they can use lower specification inputs. For example, they use an engine that is less powerful. The implication is that the willingness to supply is lower because the suppliers are willing to provide all the inputs for a lower price than they would do for a Honda car. So let's say the suppliers are willing to supply all the inputs for 6,000 for a Skoda car versus the 10,000 versus a Honda car. Then we would say that the Skoda car has a willingness to supply advantage relative to the Honda car. Now, as the last step, we are defining competitive advantage as the difference between willingness to pay and willingness to supply. So, for example, for the Tesla car, you can see that the willingness to pay versus the willingness to supply, that gap is bigger than the gap for the Honda car. Likewise, the gap for Skoda between the willingness to supply and the willingness to pay is bigger than for the Honda car. So in this situation, we would say that relative to Honda, Tesla has a competitive advantage. Relative to Honda, Skoda has a competitive advantage. Let's look at it in a more formal notation. Usually, competitive advantage is defined whenever your gap between willingness to pay and willingness to supply is greater than that of your rival. So here's the formal notations, but importantly, don't focus on the notation, really focus on the intuition. What is this saying? It's comparing the gap of your business, willingness to pay and willingness to supply, with the gap of that of your rival, willingness to pay and willingness to supply. Whenever your gap is greater than that of your rival, you have a competitive advantage. Now there's two takeaways. The first is we're comparing a single business. We're talking about your business, your single business, and we're comparing that with someone else's business, a rival's business. Let's move on to the goal of corporate strategy. Honda doesn't just make cars. They also make robots and solar panels, among many other things. Now, when we talk about corporate advantage, what we're really comparing is when all these businesses are under common ownership, as is currently the case, versus the situation where each of these businesses is under separate ownership. So, for example, when the robots, the cars, and the solar panels would not be under common ownership, but under separate ownership. That means that each business would be owned by someone else. Now we say that corporate advantage exists if the value of all these businesses under common ownership is greater than the value of those businesses under separate ownership. So we can say whenever the left-hand side, common ownership, is worth more than the right-hand side, separate ownership, we say that corporate advantage exists. Here's the more formal notation. Again, I don't want you to focus on the notation, but on the intuition. We define corporate advantage as a situation when businesses A and B, jointly owned, are worth more than the same businesses owned separately, whenever the left-hand side is greater than the right-hand side. And I want you to focus on two implications. First is comparing multiple businesses, A and B, and is making that comparison jointly owned versus separately owned. So we're discussing the difference between corporate strategy and business strategy. And in this video, we've seen one difference, the goal. For business strategy, that is competitive advantage. For corporate strategy, that is corporate advantage. Now, corporate advantage is not just maximizing competitive advantage, because when you want to maximize corporate advantage, you could sacrifice the competitive advantage for one business as long as you compensate it with increasing the competitive advantage of another business. So what's the implication for you? Well, if you're looking at a portfolio of businesses, if you're looking at multiple businesses, then you should not simply maximize competitive advantage, but you should focus on maximizing corporate advantage. So we're comparing business with corporate strategy. And so far we've already seen two differences. The first one was the difference between analyzing a single business for business strategy and analyzing multiple businesses for corporate strategy. The second difference that we have seen is the goal of maximizing competitive advantage versus maximizing the goal of corporate advantage. Now, let's look at the final key difference. Who's the competition? Let's look at LVMH. At the business level, competition is anyone who can negatively affect our prices or our cost. So let's look at the champagne business. Who's the competition there? Well, it's other companies that make champagne. Who's the competition for the handbags? Well, those would be the handbag producers. Now, importantly, the handbag producers are very likely to be different than the champagne producers. Thus, you have one set of competitors for the handbags and a different set of competitors for the champagne. Likewise, for the watches, who's the competition there? It's watch producers who are very likely to be different again from both the handbag producers and the competition for the champagne producers. So that's at the level of the business. Now let's turn to the level of the corporation. At the corporate level, competition is anyone who can assemble similar portfolios of businesses. Let's look at some of the competitors. Here's a list of common competitors at the corporate level: mutual fund managers, activist investors, private equity investors, other corporate strategists, which would be other multi-business firms. Now, each of these assemble stakes in multiple businesses. What do mutual fund managers do? They take small stakes in many businesses. Activist investors take slightly bigger stakes, but in a smaller number of businesses. Private equity investors oftentimes take complete ownership of a limited number of businesses. And other corporate strategists, well, they're like LVMH. So they take oftentimes full or partial ownership in a limited number of businesses. Now, if you look at that list, one thing that is varying across this list is the ability of these actors to influence the decisions taken at the business level. A mutual fund manager has a stake in many different businesses, but that is not to say that they have a strong ability to influence the decision at the business level. Activist investor, why are they called activists? Is precisely because over and beyond what mutual fund managers do, they try to influence the decisions at the business level. Of course, the ability to do so is severely restricted by the size of their ownership stake. So if they only have a 2% ownership stake, they might not be able to change much of the strategies at the business or corporate level. In contrast, private equity investors, because they have full ownership, are able to influence much of what's going on at the business level, as are other corporate strategies. So we can say that among these actors, the ability to influence businesses goes up. Thus, the last difference between business and corporate strategy that I'd like to discuss with you is competition. Now, what's the implication for you? Well, it basically determines how you compete as a corporate strategist. Fundamentally, you can compete in two ways. First, by selection, picking businesses for better prices or businesses that the shareholders may not have access to. So we're really talking about which businesses to combine under common ownership, joint ownership, which is called the selection approach. The other way to compete is through modification. So given a set of businesses, you're going to make changes to those businesses to make them work better together. So here the key point is joint decision making, or what is also called modification. Just like competition at the business level, competition at the corporate level raises the bar for us. We need to do at least as well as the competition can, if not better. A natural benchmark is oftentimes competing with a mutual fund manager. Because from that list, you should be doing at least as well as they are doing, if not better. If you're not doing better, it's unclear why you should own the businesses jointly rather than a mutual fund manager. In countries with few mutual funds, as a corporate strategist, we might be okay just selecting undervalued companies. We can compete by picking better businesses or by paying lower prices. In such situations, merely selecting businesses might be sufficient for us as corporate strategists. But let's think about countries with fairly efficient capital markets. Then it becomes harder and harder to do better than mutual fund managers. Why should we be able to pick better businesses or spot them at better prices than these mutual fund managers can? In such situation, merely selecting businesses is oftentimes insufficient to do better than mutual fund managers, and you probably need a corporate strategy also based on modification. Basically, in efficient capital markets, we're forced to do things that mutual fund managers cannot do. In particular, it's very likely that our corporate strategy is going to shift from a selection-based approach to one that is also based on the modification-based approach. Likewise, the existence and abilities of the other competitors, like activist investors and private equity firms, push the bar for you as a corporate strategist. The last difference between business and corporate strategy is who's the competition. Now, what's the implication for you? It basically means that as a corporate strategist, we need to be aware who the competition is. Based on who the competition is, it influences what type of corporate strategies are attractive to us and not. And in particular, I'm thinking here about the attractiveness of selection versus the attractiveness of modification. We have seen the foundations of corporate strategy. Next, I'd like to discuss a tool that is commonly used within corporate strategy, a sum of the parts analysis. This is a quantitative technique that people use to value multi-business firms. Why is this technique important to you? A sum of the parts analysis can become a tool of power. Have you ever been in a meeting that was about the discussion of a complicated spreadsheet that you didn't fully understand? Now, what did you do in that situation? If you're like many of us, chances are that you didn't do anything. You may have kept quiet. And that is such a pity, because not only is your opinion lost, it might be that you are the expert in the business or businesses that are being discussed. Thus, I want you to be ready. The goal is not for you to become an expert in this technique. Rather, I want you to understand the method, be able to do some of the basic calculations yourself, and most importantly, participate in that discussion. The way we're going to make progress is we start by valuing a single business and then move to valuing multiple businesses. We're going to value a single business, and let's say that business is a shipbuilding business. As we're going to value business number 4, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the information of other shipbuilding businesses, number 1, 2, and 3, to come up with some data that we can use for shipbuilding business number 4. The second column that you see is enterprise value. That basically means how much is the company worth. So if you were to buy that company or that business, how much would you have to pay? So for business 1, that would be 120. The third column is earnings, which is what were the earnings in the last year. And for this particular company number 1, it was 20. Given that we have information on enterprise value and on earnings, we can calculate what is called a multiple. In particular, we can calculate a multiple of enterprise value over earnings. Let's do the calculation and then let's think about what it is. So it's a ratio, which means that we need to divide 120 by 20, which is 6. What does this multiple represent? Well, It basically means if you want to buy business 1, you have to pay 6 times last year's earnings. We can calculate the same multiple for the other businesses. So if we want to calculate the multiple for business 2, we do 70 divided by 10 equals 7. Likewise, for business 3, we divide 120 by 15 equals 8. Now the next step is, given these 3 multiples, we're going to calculate the average across these 3 multiples. And it turns out the average of 6, 7, and 8 is 7. Now we've come up with an average price for the other businesses. Basically, we know on average a shipbuilding business is worth about 7 times its last year earnings. So in order to value shipbuilding business number 4, we're going to use that average and then calculate the enterprise value. So the next step for us is to use that average multiple. So we take this number and then do the opposite calculation. We have the multiple, we have the earnings, so we should be able to calculate enterprise value. And the way to do that is we're going to multiply the multiple times the earnings, because then earnings falls out and you're left with enterprise value. So 15 times 7 is 105. Just to recap, we're using the average value of the other businesses, 1, 2, and 3, to calculate an enterprise value for number 4. We have more confidence in our valuation if businesses 1, 2, and 3 are more similar to business 4. We have less confidence in our valuation if businesses 1, 2, and 3 are more different than number 4. We've just valued a single business. Now let's move to the case of valuing a multi-business firm. And let's say our multi-business firm has 3 businesses: shipbuilding, home building, and trucking. The basic idea is that what we did for shipbuilding, that is comparing it with other shipbuilding businesses, we're going to do exactly the same for home building and for trucking. For home building, we will be comparing that business with other home building businesses, and for trucking, we will be comparing that with other trucking businesses. So let's recap. In shipbuilding, we had calculated a multiple of 7 using the 3 other shipbuilding businesses. Now using that multiple, we could calculate a value for the shipbuilding business. And the way we did that was we multiplied 7 times 15, giving us an enterprise value for just that shipbuilding business of 105. Now we're going to apply the exact same technique for home building. And let's say our comparison with other home building businesses yielded an average multiple of 11. And just to recap, that meant that on average, the home building businesses are worth roughly 11 times last year's earning. If we multiply that multiple of 11 times 10, we can derive the enterprise value for just home building. So 10 times 11 is giving us 110. As the next step, we're going to replicate the exact same procedure for trucking. We compare other trucking businesses and we find that there the average multiple is 8. Again, that means on average a trucking business is worth 8 times last year's earning. So if we multiply 8 times 20, we can infer a value of our trucking business using the value of other trucking businesses. Now we've come up with a value for each business separately. 105 for shipbuilding, 110 for home building, 160 for trucking. Now we want to calculate the value of the entire multi-business firm. There's only one step remaining, and that is we need to include or incorporate headquarters. There's basically 2 ways of doing that. Either you can subtract the cost of headquarters directly from the earnings of the individual businesses. That is, you would allocate some cost to shipbuilding, allocate some cost to home building, and allocate yet the remaining part to trucking, which lead to lower earnings for each of these businesses. Or you could do, as is done here, include it at the very end. Either way is fine, but what's important to remember is if you do it at the end, we're talking about the ongoing cost. of corporate headquarters. It's not necessarily, or it's not last year's earnings only. Now we have all pieces in place and we can calculate the enterprise value for our multi-business firm. The way to do that is we're going to add everything in this column of enterprise value, and we need to keep into account that headquarters has a minus. So we subtract that from the whole. So if we add all these numbers, 105, that gives us 365. So now, based on our sum of the parts analysis, we've concluded that our multi-business firm is worth 365. Actual sum of the parts are slightly more complicated, but not by a lot. And in fact, the underlying logic is the same. So I hope you can now follow a sum of the parts analysis. Let's just recap what we have done. For each business of the multi-business firm, we're going to look for a group of focus peers. That means a group of single business firms that are comparable to the business that we want to value. Using that group of focus peers, we're going to calculate an average multiple. We use that multiple of those other single business firms to calculate the business or the value of our business. And we're going to do that as often as the number of businesses that we have in the multi-business firm. Once we have valued each business of our multi-business firm, we're going to add all values of these businesses, which gives us a value for the multi-business firm. The one thing that we need to keep in mind as a last step, we need to include or subtract the cost of corporate headquarters. We can either do that in step 1 or as the very last step as a step 3. This is the basic mechanism of a sum of the parts analysis. From the sum of the parts analysis, we concluded that the enterprise value was 365. Now we can think of that enterprise value consisting of 2 parts. And those parts correspond to the way a firm is typically financed: debt and equity, or shareholders and bondholders. So one part of the firm or the enterprise belongs to the bondholders, the other part belongs to the shareholders. The part that belongs to the bondholders we refer to as debt or net debt. The remaining part that belongs to the shareholders, we refer to that as equity. Now we're interested in calculating the equity value. So if we know the enterprise value, which is the total circle, and we know the portion of net debt, then we can subtract one from another, giving us the equity value. So what we're going to do is we take the 365 minus the 165, giving us an equity value of 200. Now what we've done is we went from the value of the entire enterprise to the value of the equity, that is the value for the shareholders. If we want to calculate the value per share, all that we need to do is divide by the number of shares. Here the number of shares is very low, 20. But imagine that this actually represents 20 million and the equity value that we have been calculating is also in millions. Then we can say the equity value per share is simply the equity value divided by the number of shares, which is the 200 divided by the 20, giving us an equity value per share of 10. Now this is how much we think the share should be worth based on our sum of the parts analysis. As the last step, we can compare our calculations with how much the share is actually trading for. In our sum of the parts analysis, we calculated an equity value per share of 10. We can compare that number with the price for which the share is actually trading. Let's say that share is trading currently at 9, which means that our calculations are higher than the share price. Thus, our sum of the parts analysis yielded a price that was actually higher than the price that the share is currently trading for. And actually, that is a common finding across many sum of the parts analysis of multi-business firms. Now, what does that mean? Let's go to the next video to find out. We've seen how to do a sum of the parts analysis, but what does it mean for us corporate strategists? Just to recap, in our sum of the parts analysis, we concluded that the equity value per share was 10, whereas the price for which the share was currently trading was only 9. If you're a financial analyst, let's say you're working for Barclays, which is actually right over there, you can look at these calculations as follows. You can say, well, actually the share price is cheap. We calculated that it should be worth 10, but the actual price is only 9. So in other words, you could say the share is undervalued. Now, if through our calculations we conclude that the share is very undervalued, you might be willing to trade on that. You could say, I'm going to buy the share with the expectation or hope that the share price will go up in the future. But what about us, corporate strategies? What can we learn? Can we learn anything about corporate advantage? Here is the fundamentals of the sum of the parts. We calculated an enterprise value. For each business of our multi-business firm, we used multiples of single business peers. That is enterprise value over earnings multiples. Then we took the actual earnings of our own business and multiplied these to get enterprise value. We repeated these steps for each of our businesses. The sum of the businesses, that is, the sum of the parts, then gives an enterprise value for the entire multi-business firm. The formula shows a brief summary of this approach. It comes down to a multiplication between our actual earnings of the multi-business firm and multiples of single business peers. Corporate advantage is when businesses owned together are worth more than the businesses owned separately. Thus, we could say that corporate advantage compares the businesses when part of a multi-business firm versus when they are single businesses instead. This seems closely related to the comparison of a sum of the parts analysis. Can a sum of the parts analysis tell us something about corporate advantage? No and yes. No, because earnings are taken as fixed. It's the actual earnings of the businesses when owned jointly. We take that as an input to our calculations. From the calculations, we can never infer what earnings would be like if owned separately. Thus, a sum of the parts analysis cannot tell us what our businesses would be worth if owned separately. However, a sum of the parts analysis can tell you whether the market values a given level of earnings differently for your multi-business firm than for comparable single business firms. Let me explain. If we find that the sum of the parts is higher than the share price, it basically means that the multiple for which the single business peers are trading is higher than the multiple for which you are trading. This implies that the market values a $1 earning of your single business peers more than a $1 earning of your multi-business firm. One reason for this difference could be that the market does not understand your corporate strategy, and in particular how you would create value across your different businesses. In summary, a sum of the parts can provide insight on the multiple, but not on the earnings. Thus, a sum of the parts analysis cannot tell us whether we have corporate advantage. However, it can give us an indication of how well the market values our earnings. And in effect, that means how well the market appreciates and understands our corporate strategy. Welcome back to corporate strategy. Last week we talked about one of the key decisions in corporate strategy being which business should you enter. Now, this week we're going to pick up on that discussion and talk about diversification, which is entering a new business. When you think about diversification, there's really three types of questions that you should be asking yourself. First is whether you should diversify, that is, whether you should even enter a new business. The second is, which business should you enter? There's so many businesses out there, which business is the right one for you? And lastly, how can you even enter a new business? What are some of the options that you have available that you can choose from? What we're going to do in this week is really thinking about these three questions, and we're going to use a structured approach. It's a series of steps that you can use and then apply in your setting. Now, let's begin our discussion of diversification with some examples. The first example is the Finnish Post. Like many national post carriers, their main business is delivering the post to your homes. Now, the Finnish Post recently has decided to diversify into a new business. They now offer also to mow your lawn. So they not only deliver your mail, they also can mow the lawn for you. And the reason they can offer that is they do that on quiet days. When the volume of the post is limited, they have spare time, and the person delivering your mail can then also mow your lawn. The next example is MOOC, which is a new hotel chain. And do you know who's behind this? Well, you might be surprised to learn that one of the founders of this hotel chain is IKEA. Of course, we all know IKEA from its furniture that you need to self-assemble, but they also have a real estate business. They typically rent out office space to companies. But now they've decided we want to use our real estate business and enter the hotel business. And what's interesting is that they teamed up with Marriott, which is one of the largest hotel operators in the world. The last example is Fosun, a Chinese company. Originally, it started off as an insurance company, but they have since diversified into many, many different businesses. So they now offer also financing for leasing a car. They're into the entertainment business. They're even into the tourism business. They recently bought a company, ROC Oil, which is an Australian company, which took Fosun into the oil business. Now, what's interesting with this example, with many other diversification examples that you see, is that oftentimes they're quite exotic. The diversification move oftentimes takes a company into very different businesses than they originally were in. These were three examples of diversification. So diversification is entering a new business. Here's a systematic representation of diversification. Let's say your company is active in footballs. So you produce footballs, and then one day you decide to enter a new business. And let's say that business is the footwear business. Before you were not active in footwear, after you are active in footwear. And that is called diversification, entering a new business. New means here new to you, not necessarily new to the world. Because when you enter the footwear business, it's very likely that there's already producers of footwear present. So diversification and entering a new business, new for you. Thus, diversification is entering a new business. Now, from last week, we saw that we could describe a business in terms of the who, what, how. Now, entering a new business thus means whenever you change the who, or the what, or the how. The examples I picked here were mostly changes in the what, but diversification also is entering a new business by changing the who or the how. Now, in the next slide, we're going to look at how you can enter a new business. So what are some of the options that you have available to pursue your diversification? In the last video, we saw some examples of what diversification is. But how can firms diversify? What options do you have available if you want to diversify? The firms in our previous examples go about diversification quite differently. If you think back to our example of the Finnish Post, they entered the lawn mowing business on their own. They did that without the help of anyone else. We call that organic growth. The second example we looked at was MOOC, a partnership between IKEA on the one hand and Marriott on the other hand. That partnership we call an alliance. The last example was Fosun entering the oil business. As you saw, they also teamed up with someone else, which was the Australian company called RSC Oil. Now, it wasn't just an alliance, Fosun actually bought RSC Oil. We call that an acquisition, or oftentimes referred to as an M&A. M&A stands for mergers and acquisitions, but we don't really care so much about the difference between a merger and an acquisition. So I'll be talking about an M&A or an acquisition interchangeably. If you're considering diversification, then we can describe the main choices that you have using something called a growth tree. Let's walk through the three step by step. So at the top you see entering new business, which is the diversification decision. At the first tree, or at the first branch, the choice is between, on the one hand, inorganic growth, and on the other hand, organic growth. That simply means, do you do it on your own, organic growth, or do you team up with someone else, inorganic growth? Within inorganic growth, you have the choice between an acquisition, so-called M&A, or alliances. What you see is that there's actually a further distinction within alliances, and it's something called non-equity versus equity alliances. Let's look in detail what that is. Here's a continuum of relationship between firms. On the one hand, you have what is called an arm's length relationship, which entails very little interactions between two firms. On the other side of the spectrum, you have an M&A, which entails a lot of interaction between two firms. As we move from the left, arm's length, towards the right, M&A, two things happen. The first thing is that the intensity of collaboration between firms increases. So let me just add that here. The intensity of collaboration goes up as we move from the left to the right. The other thing that happens is that the level of equity of one partner in another increases. The level of equity goes up as we go from an arm's length relationship to an M&A relationship. Now, equity simply means ownership. So at the left-hand side, there's no ownership. On the right-hand side, one company actually owns another company. Now, what does ownership do? Basically, it does three things. First, it aligns incentives between partners. Second, it facilitates coordination. And lastly, it enables information flows. In the middle, between arm's length and M&A, you have a category called alliances. These are relationships between firms that cannot be managed by a contract alone. A close working relationship is needed. It's different from an M&A in the sense that the partners remain independent, whereas in an M&A, one partner owns the other partner. Alliances are also different from arm's length relationship in the sense that there's more collaboration ongoing. Let's look in a bit more detail at these different categories to really understand the differences between them. So let's begin with the non-equity alliance. Non-equity means no partner has an ownership stake in the other. What I'm showing you here is actually 4 examples all entered into by Fosun. So it turns out that Fosun has a non-equity alliance with Daimler to help finance leasing contracts for the customers. So basically they formed an alliance. So Fosun formed an alliance with Daimler, which is a producer of cars. There's intense collaboration, but there's no equity. That means Fosun does not have a stake in Daimler. Fosun also has an alliance with Cirque du Soleil. Now, the difference with this one is that it's an equity alliance, meaning that Fosun has a stake, an ownership stake in Cirque du Soleil. The third example is Thomas Cook, which is a company active in the tourism industry. Fosun and Thomas Cook formed a joint venture. This is actually an instance of an equity alliance, but it has a specific structure. Now the first thing to note is that a joint venture really means it's a new venture. So Thomas Cook and Fosun started a new company, and it's joint in the sense that both companies are owners of that new company. So Fosun is one owner, Thomas Cook is the other owner in that new company. Now oftentimes with joint ventures, the split is 50-50. I own 50% of the new venture, you own the other 50%, but that's not a given. We can vary our ownership stake. The last category is called M&A, and here the difference is that one company owns the other company. So one company has full ownership of the other company. Fosun bought ROC Oil, that means Fosun is the owner of ROC Oil. So we've seen the options of how to diversify. At the very top of the growth tree, we have the choice between inorganic and organic. Within inorganic, we have the choice between M&A and alliances. And then as the last step, within alliances, you have equity versus non-equity alliances. In the next video, we'll look at when to diversify. We have seen what diversification is, entering a new business. We've also seen how we can diversify, organic growth, alliances, or M&A. But when would we diversify? Here's the situation that we're facing. Let's say we're in a business A. We want to know if diversifying into business B creates more value. So what we want to do is we want to compare the old situation with the new situation where we're active in both business A and B. Let's break that down. The old situation is VA, that is the value of business A. The new situation is value of business A and B, so V of A and B. Now importantly, we need to consider the cost of getting from the old situation to the new situation, which is here indicated by the cost of entering business B. So really what we're doing is we're comparing the old situation with the new situation while taking into account the transition from old to new. As you may have noticed, there's little M's on the slides. These refer to the growth mode. So the basic idea is that the cost of entering a business really depends on the growth mode that you choose. So if you enter through an organic mode, the cost of entry are really your internal investments. If you enter through an alliance, then the cost of entry are really the cost of setting up that alliance. If you're entering through an acquisition, it's really the additional cost that you pay for acquiring that company. Likewise, the value of businesses A and B together depend on the growth mode. So you can think of the value being created through an alliance might be very different than the value that's being created through an M&A. One key takeaway then is that when we compare the old with the new situation, we should do so for every growth mode separately. For precision, I'm offering you here a definition. The notation is not that important for you to remember. However, I do want you to remember the basic trade-offs. The first one is the trade-off between before and after. So what we're doing is we're comparing the initial situation, that the situation where we're just in business A, versus the situation where we are in both A and B. The second trade-off, or the second thing I want you to remember, is that we need to take into account the cost of entry. So it's not just sufficient thinking about what would be the end state once we're both in A and B, but it's also important to think about how do we get there. And then the last thing I want you to remember is the little m's, which refer to the growth mode. Basically, both the cost of entry and the value of being in both businesses together really depend on the growth mode. So again, don't worry if this notation doesn't come natural to you. It's really about the insight. So what's the key insight that we can take away from this? Well, it gives us the basic conditions for when to diversify. The decision to enter a new business depends on just two things. First, synergies, second, bargains. Let's start with synergies. We'll talk in more detail what synergies are, but that basically means that the value of operating both business A and B is higher if they're jointly operated than if they were operated separately. Thus, the higher the synergies, the more value from linking business A and B. The lower the synergies, the less value in linking business A and B. What we can see is that more synergies would make diversification more attractive. Now, if we link it back to our previous notation, then we can think about synergies relating to the V, the value of being in both business A and B, depending on the growth mode. The second dimension is bargains. A bargain is if you pay less for a business than what it's worth. If business B is a bargain, then you're more likely to enter. If the price of B is very high, then you're less likely to diversify. Again, we can link it back to our initial equation or our initial formula, and then bargaining cost is related to the cost of entry. If the cost of entry is less than the value of that business, you're more likely to enter that business. If you put both conditions together, you see clear implications. If you have and synergies and bargains, you're very likely to want to diversify. If, on the other hand, you don't have synergies and business B is not really a bargain, you're very unlikely to want to diversify. The implications are clear when both are no or both are yes. But oftentimes, one is going to be yes and the other is going to be no. Then a careful assessment is needed between the cost of entry and the synergies. We'll look at a systematic way of doing that. In the next video, we look more closely at synergies, which is one of the most important concepts in corporate strategy. In the last video, we saw that synergies is one of the key drivers of diversification. In fact, synergies is one of the most important constructs within all of corporate strategy. Unfortunately, it's also one of the biggest buzzwords within this domain and often misused by many people. I want to ensure that you have a good understanding of what synergies are and apply it correctly. Now, when I say synergies, what we're really going to do is look at operational synergies. We say that operational synergies exist if the value of two businesses operated together is worth more than the value of those businesses operated separately. Let's begin with an example. Here you see two businesses. One business produces toys for children. The other business produces plastic kitchenware. How can we create synergies between these businesses? In other words, how can we create more value through jointly operating these businesses? Well, one way is perhaps through the manufacturing facilities. Perhaps we can use the manufacturing facilities for kitchenware to also produce toys. One could then eliminate the manufacturing facilities for the toys, and you could produce the same with fewer. Hence, this would be one way to create potential value from jointly operating toys and kitchenware, specifically through manufacturing. Where do synergies come from? Because it's from joint operations, it must mean that the synergies arise from the value chain. If we look one step deeper, it's really about resources that underlie the value chain, because that's ultimately where the value comes from. Now, resources are the factors of production, classically defined as land, labor, and capital. More commonly, however, we think of these as such things as technologies, people, and manufacturing facilities. Many classification schemes for synergies exist out there. Unfortunately, they tend to take a financial perspective, which is helpful for financial analysts, but possibly not so helpful for us as managers or as corporate strategists. What we really care about is the operational side of things. We care about where synergies come from, what's their root cause. So what we did, together with my co-author Vanneste Puranam, we developed our own classification scheme. We call it the 4Cs Synergies Framework. I'll guide you through it. The framework uses two dimensions: whether resources are similar or not, and the extent to which resources need to be modified to capture the synergies. we've seen an example of consolidation. In the toys and plastic kitchenware example, one could modify similar resources to eliminate redundancies. This is consolidation because it relates to similar resources, the manufacturing facilities, and to capture the synergies, one of the resources needed to be modified substantially if we are to close one of the facilities. There's three other types: combination, customization, and connection. Let's look at them in turn. This is an example of combination, pooling similar resources to achieve scale without the need of massive modification of those resources. We're going to look at the same business we did before, the toys business, but this time we're linking it with a different business, the drinking glasses business. So what we're interested in is how can we combine these businesses to create more value from jointly operating them? Well, one way could be by linking the procurement steps. Let's say drinking glasses, for their shipments, they use a lot of packaging and cardboard. If we say that toys need similar packaging or cardboard, perhaps we can combine our demand and get a better price from our supplier. So one way that we can possibly create value is by combining procurement of drinking glasses and the procurement step of toys. Now, unlike the previous example of consolidation, where we had to really change the resources, remember, we had to close one of the manufacturing facilities. Here, in this example of combination, it's fairly easy, in a relative sense, to combine the procurement step of drinking glasses with that of toys. It all comes down to simply giving a call to our supplier and say, hey, we're buying more from you. Can you give us a better price? The next example is connection, pooling dissimilar resources to facilitate their joint use without the need for substantial modification of those resources. We're looking at the same business as before, the toys business, but this time we're thinking about ways to link it with a children's books business. Here's one way that we can connect these two businesses. Let's say children's books are currently being sold abroad, for which they have an international distribution network. Now let's say our toys business is only operating locally within our own home country. Now one way that we can connect these businesses is if we were to take these toys and sell them through the international distribution network of children's books. Basically what we're doing is we're connecting the sales segment or the distribution segment of toys to the international sales of children's book. Now we can say these are dissimilar resources because one is international and the other is not. And it's precisely because they are different that we want to connect them. The modification required, we can say, might not be that high because we will be using the existing resource without much need for modification. Hence, we would say this is an example of connection. The last example is customization, linking different resources to make them work better together with the need of substantial modification. We're looking again at our toys business. This time we want to link it with a consumer electronics business. The question that we have is, can we customize one or both of the resources to make them work better together? Here's one way. Let's say we want to link the R&D of both businesses. Let's further assume consumer electronics has some interesting speech recognition software. Unfortunately, it's been tested on children and it doesn't pick up the children's voices very well. Luckily, the R&D of toys knows very well how children speak and behave. Perhaps there's some value of linking these two R&D resources. Now, linking them is not sufficient. We actually need to modify them, we need to enhance them, we need to improve them in order to create value. One way of creating value by linking these businesses is by linking the R&D segments. Now, this is an instance of customization because we're dealing with dissimilar resources. On the one hand, the speech recognition software, on the other hand, the knowledge about children's voices and behavior. The second criteria for customization is enhancement or modification. Here, we need to enhance or modify the R&D resources in order to create value. An example of customization. We now have a better understanding of what synergies are and how we can classify them. But just one tip, think about these dimensions, similarity of resources and the extent of modification. These are continuous. It might not be all or nothing. In that case, it might be difficult for us to classify a given synergies neatly in one of these 4 boxes. That's totally fine. Don't worry about that. In fact, the goal of the 4Cs framework and its emphasis on value chain and resources is not about classifying synergy, it's really about seeking synergies. Then what we call a given synergy is of much, much lesser importance. We've seen the basic ingredients to a diversification decision. We started off by thinking about how to diversify, whether you should do inorganic growth or organic growth. And then within inorganic, we thought about alliance versus acquisition. We also looked at the conditions for diversification, especially bargains versus synergies. If you have both, great. If you have neither, better not to diversify. And if you have just one of them, we needed a careful assessment. Then as a last point, we realized that it's difficult or impossible to think about the question of whether you should diversify independently of how to diversify. You really need to think about them at the same time. How can we link all of this? I'm going to take you through a 5-step approach that takes into account each of these considerations and help you make a diversification decision. These are the 5 practical steps. First, finding synergies. Second, identifying resource gaps. This is basically to what extent do we already have the resources for the new business and which resources are still missing. Those that are missing, we either need to build or borrow from someone else. Third, identifying candidates. Who could we potentially team up with to enter that new business? Fourth, ally or acquire. We need to compare the different modes. It turns out that it's easiest to start with the inorganic modes. So we first need to identify the best inorganic mode, whether that is ally or acquire. 5. Organic or inorganic growth. We need to compare the best inorganic growth mode with the organic mode. In the next set of videos, we're going to discuss each step in turn. This should allow you to apply these 5-step procedures to evaluate or recommend a diversification move. We're now going to discuss the 5-step approach to a diversification decision. And the first step is finding synergies. We've seen that synergies is a key driver of diversification, so we need a systematic way to find and identify them. We want to find synergies. Because we're looking at operational synergies, it means that we have to look at the value chain. A value chain is a series of activities that are necessary to produce and deliver a product to your customers. We can actually link this very easily to our initial description of a business in terms of its who, what, how. We can say that a value chain is a description of the how. It's a series of activities that brings or produces a product and brings it to your customers. So the output of a value chain is really a product in terms of the what delivered to customers, the who. The important point here is that synergies are really in the how, not necessarily in the what or the who. We're looking at operations, we're looking at the how. So you may have heard of an unsolved matrix when thinking about diversification. What that really is doing is comparing the products and customers in the current situation with the new situation. So it's a 2 by 2 matrix. With on the axis customers and products. For each of these, you can think about existing and new. So existing customers and new customers. Likewise, existing products and new products. I find this framework useful to communicate a diversification decision because it neatly captures whether you're entering a business that with the same products or different products, with new customers or the same customers. However, I do not find it useful to decide on a diversification move, and the reason is the following. What it really does is comparing the what and the who. We've just seen that the synergies are not in the what and who, rather they're in the how. So one way to see it, customers really is the who, products really is the what. If our diversification is based on synergies, then we cannot infer from this matrix where we should go. Let's walk through an example. Let's say you're working for a sports car manufacturer, for example the nice Ferrari that you see here, and your boss has identified the theme parks business as a potentially attractive business to diversify into. How can we decide whether this move would be good or not? You might think that this example is a bit far-fetched. I certainly think so. But the example will help us think through the different steps. So how do we start? Begin with drawing value chains of the existing business, in this case that's a sports car business, and the value chain for the new business, in this case the theme parks business. Note that you can draw a value chain of a generic business or one that is specific to the partner. At this stage, it doesn't really matter that much. The value chains can be quite crude. Just take 3 to 7 steps, which is oftentimes enough detail for us to do the analysis. And notice that we're mixing here primary and support activities. That might be okay for the purposes of our diversification analysis. The goal is structured speculation. So even a crude value chain will help us achieve that goal. We want to run the following thought experiment. Could you justify paying a premium for an acquisition of a well-performing theme park business? At this stage, we're not saying that we're going to do an acquisition, but we just want to say, if we were to do an acquisition, where would the value come from? If we find it difficult to think about what the sources of value would come from, then that's a clear indication that a diversification move is not suitable. The question that we're really asking is, where are the synergies? I'm going to do some speculation here. You may find some synergies more plausible than others, but that's precisely the point. We want to really see where the value potentially could be. I'm going to focus on 3. Let's begin with R&D. Perhaps we as a Ferrari company or a sports car business can help build a new theme park. I think that's a little bit far-fetched, but perhaps there's some knowledge that we have as a sports car manufacturer that could be helpful in theme park business. Again, I'm a bit doubtful, but I'm just putting it out there. The next one, branding, is I think more plausible. Perhaps we could take our brand, the Ferrari brand, and apply it to a new theme park business. If our brand is very strong, people might want to go to the new theme park business because it's associated with our sports car business. This would be a connection type of synergy. And for the last step, maybe there's some value from linking sales with service delivery. Now, service delivery of a theme parks is very different than the sales of a sports car, but maybe we can do some connection type of synergies where we sell our sports car in the theme parks. Perhaps it's a bit unlikely because you would think that buying a sports car is not really an impulse purchase, but again, I'm just putting it out there. If you want to think about the synergies between these two businesses, these would be some of the places where you would start. Now we know if we were to link these two businesses, where the value would come from. If you have difficulty identifying any value, you know that a potential diversification move will have to be justified on the grounds of it being a bargain, the price being very, very low. Let's move to the next step in our 5-step diversification approach. So we're looking at the diversification decision, entering a new business. In the previous video, we looked at identifying synergies between the existing and the new business. The next step for us is to identify resource gaps. Here are the 5 steps. We did step 1, synergies. Let's do step 2, resource gaps. The basic question that we're addressing is, if we enter the new business, do we have the resources required to run that business? Now we can think about 2 extremes. On the one end, we have no resources required for the new business. That basically means that the resource gap is big and we need to either build up those resources or partner with someone else. On the other side, it could be that we already have most, if not all, resources required. In that case, the resource gap is small. Now let's think back to our initial example of finished post diversifying into the lawn mowing business. The key resource there was the mail delivery service personnel. And it was precisely that they had excess capacity, they had low volume days, that they could easily shift their activities from mail delivery to lawn mowing. So in that specific instance, the resource gap was small and they found it very easy to enter the lawn mowing business. Let's look at our earlier example, sports cars diversifying into theme parks. Now, we need to think about what resources does the sports car business already have that can be used or applied in the new business, theme parks. We can go through it step by step. Now, you'll soon realize that these businesses are quite different, which probably means that the resources required could be very, very different as well. Now, if we think about R&D, the first step, there might be very little that we can actually leverage from the sports car business into the theme cars business. We thought about maybe applying the knowledge about how to design a car could also potentially be useful about theme parks, but there's a whole lot more to it. So perhaps we can say sports cars has a little bit of the R&D required for theme cars business, but within that activity, there's still some gap. So we can say there's somewhat of a resource gap even within R&D. Now for procurement and manufacturing is very clear. Sports car has very little to do with theme parks. So we think that these resource gaps are going to be substantial in each of these activities. The next one is an interesting one, branding. Think back to our earlier synergy example. We figured out that perhaps branding is the most valuable of all the synergies that we identified. And the reason it was the most valuable is because we thought we could fairly easily reapply the brand of the sports car, of the Ferrari, onto the theme parks. If that's the case, we say that the resource gap in branding is low. So the last step is service delivery. Now this step is very different than anything a sports car business does. So again, we could say the resource gap is probably quite substantial in that segment. Hence, it would seem that a sports cars manufacturer has quite a big resource gap that needs to be filled before entering the theme park business. So if we think about the 2 extremes, on the one end, already having most or all of the resources, and on the other hand, having very little resources that can be usefully applied in the new business, Ferrari is probably on the latter end. All of the remaining gaps need to be either filled organically or inorganically. To recap, in this step, we're looking at the additional resources required to enter a new business. On one hand, it could be that you have most of the resources. On the other hand, it could be that you have still quite a few resources that either need building or can be acquired or borrowed from someone else. We're deciding whether to enter a new business. In the previous step, we identified resource gaps. These gaps need to be filled, either through organic growth or inorganic growth. It turns out that it's easier to consider the inorganic growth option first. That's what we're going to do. Here are the 5 steps again. We did step 1, synergies. We did step 2, resource gaps. Resource gaps can be done at the level of the generic value chain. Now it's time to be more specific and identify potential candidates. The reason is that optimal inorganic growth choices might vary by partner. So let's move to step 3, identifying candidates. Broadly speaking, there are 3 types of potential candidates. The first is insider generalist. These are companies that are already active in the new business and occupy all steps in the value chain. The second category is also insiders, but this time specialists. So they're active in the new business, but only do a subset of the value chain segment. So only a few steps of the value chain. And then the last category is outsiders. So these are companies that might help you to enter a new business, but are not active in that business themselves. Now, if your resource gap is very large, then a useful starting point might be to begin with insiders, and particularly an insider generalist, because you would require a lot of resources, and almost by definition, an insider generalist has those resources. Let's revisit our earlier example of sports car diversifying into theme parks. Now, we've just said that if your resource gap is large, it might be useful to start with an insider and perhaps an insider generalist. It turns out that the theme parks value chain really consists of 2 different stages, or 2 big chunks. In the first step, R&D is really about designing the theme parks, building it, setting it up. The remaining steps are really about running the place once it has been designed and built. Thus, what we could do, we could try and find insiders that are active in the first part of the value chain, companies experienced in designing and building theme parks, and we could find companies that are experienced in the second stage of that value chain, really running the place once it has been built. Because this business is new to you, you may have an idea of what type of candidates you're looking for, but you may not know their identities. So if it's important that you seek help here, maybe talk to investment bankers, maybe talk to industry experts, or maybe ask your market intelligence department to do some market research. Importantly, here you need to get specific. If you can identify no candidates, you have no choice but to do organic growth. However, if you can identify some candidates, you could consider inorganic growth. That's what we're going to look at next. In the last video, we looked at identifying candidates that help us to enter a new business. In this video, we're going to look at how to select the best relationship with those candidates. These are our 5 steps. We did identifying candidates, step 3. Now we're moving on to step 4, ally or acquire. In this step, we identify the best inorganic growth mode, which we then compare in the next step with organic growth. So in a way, if you look back to our growth tree, what we're doing is we're solving that tree from the bottom up. Begin by comparing non-equity alliance, equity alliance, and M&A. That's step 4. And then in step 5, we look at comparing inorganic growth with organic growth. Let's go back to our example. Sports cars diversifying into theme parks. Here, we're considering a single theme parks company. In reality, you would consider multiple theme parks companies because some might be better suited than others. How would you approach selecting the best inorganic mode? One way to approach this is start with the least invasive mode, that is a non-equity alliance, and then think about, can you do better by selecting the more invasive modes, equity alliance or M&A? And you want to particularly focus on the synergies that you have identified earlier. Why? Because this is where the value comes from, and because they're dependent on jointly operating, hence the type of relationship is crucial. We had looked at 3 potential synergies: R&D, branding, and sales. For R&D, we thought perhaps sports cars can help co-design the theme parks. For branding, we said maybe we can apply the Ferrari brand to the theme parks business. And for sales and service delivery, we thought maybe we can sell some of our Ferraris in the theme parks. How much collaboration is required for each of these? For R&D, a bit working together upfront seems to be necessary. For branding, again, some working together seems necessary, but perhaps not that much ongoing collaboration. For sales and service delivery, again, it might not be that essential for deep ongoing collaboration. I can run my Ferrari store, someone else runs the theme parks. Thus, it seems across all these synergies, a close working relationship might not be required, at least not on an ongoing basis. This would suggest that perhaps a non-equity alliance could be sufficient. More generally, when deciding between M&A, equity alliance and non-equity alliance, what we're really doing is deciding on the level of equity. That's the main difference between these three categories. To decide on the level of equity, we need to think about what are the benefits of equity and what are the costs. I'll show you some generic factors that drive the benefits, and I'll show you some other factors that drive the costs. Equity gives you the possibility to forge close working relationships, which can be important for your synergies. This close working relationship comes in two aspects. First, coordination, which is the alignment of action. Equity helps you to align the actions across partners. The second is cooperation. It helps you to align the incentive across partners. Now, some of the specific questions that you can ask to think about whether those benefits are needed or desirable in your setting are listed here. For coordination, is there a need for a close working relationship? Or is there extensive knowledge sharing required between the partners? For cooperation, are there some investments that are made specifically to the partner that need protection? Are the gains from synergies one-sided between partners? That means if we work together, yes, there's some gains, but perhaps it's only one partner gaining and the other not. Equity allows you to distribute these gains more equally. Lastly, equity not only helps for close working relationships, it also helps for exclusive working relationships. If you have an ownership stake in the partner, it's easier for you to control access to that partner. You might, for example, want your rivals not be able to access that partner, which you can do if you have a big equity stake, but which is very hard to do if you don't have an equity stake. We should not only think about the benefits of equity, we should also consider its costs. The most direct costs are those to acquire full or partial control. Typically, for bigger equity stakes, you usually need to pay a sizable control premium. The second aspect you need to consider when looking at the cost of equity ownership is uncertainty. If uncertainty is very high, you run the risk of paying a control premium for a business or a company that turns out to be not that valuable. Thus, the higher the uncertainty, the higher the cost of equity, because the risk is higher that the asset or the resource turns out to be not valuable. The last point that we need to consider is motivation. It could be that a higher equity stake could harm the resource you want to access. This is often the case when the key resource are people. People could lose their motivation if you come in with a big equity ownership stake, which basically means they may have to give up autonomy. If you want to invest in people-intensive resources, you have to carefully consider whether that equity stake will influence employee motivation. Now we can decide on the best inorganic growth mode. If the benefits of equity is very high, but the costs are very limited, then you would go for high equity, meaning M&A. If on the other hand the costs are very large, but the benefits are not really there, you would settle for a non-equity alliance. Now, what would you do if both the benefits are high of equity ownership, but also its cost? Now, we can basically do two things. We could settle for something in between, an equity alliance, or we could go back to our synergy analysis and really think about the synergies that is most valuable for us. Then we could think about, let's pick the inorganic growth mode that is best for that given synergy. Now that we have defined the the best inorganic growth mode, we can compare it with the organic growth mode. And that's what we're going to do in the next video. So now it's time to compare organic with inorganic growth. We're now at the last step of the 5-step approach for the diversification decision. How can we estimate the value from the organic growth option? Recall that for the diversification decision, we need to look at 2 factors: synergies and cost of entry, or bargains. For the organic growth option, one approximation for synergies in the organic growth option is whatever we came up with for synergies in the M&A option. Both rely on full ownership, so we can borrow from our earlier analysis. Thus, what it really comes down to when thinking about the organic growth option is thinking about the cost of entry. This is about building up the resources. 3 factors influence the cost of building up resources. First, whether it's easy to copy. Second, whether it's easy to catch up. And third, whether it's easy to substitute. The first factor, the ease of copying, relates to what extent can you imitate the resource that we're trying to build up. The second factor, whether it's easy to catch up, relates to what extent can you catch up with those that have gone before you. The last factor, whether it's easy to substitute, relates to the fact whether that resource is really necessary. Maybe you can use another resource to fulfill the same role. We're going to look at these factors using the example of luxury car and theme parks. Then next, we will look at these factors in a more general way. First, it might be very difficult for Ferrari to copy or to catch up with others in the theme parks business. And the reason is that there's few related resources that Ferrari has that are helpful in catching up or copying. What really could it use to leverage in the new business or to build up those resources in the theme parks business? I'm not so sure I see that many. Lastly, it also seems clear that ease of substitution is not that high. You really need all those steps. You really need the land. You really need the rights. You really need the service delivery. It's really difficult to think about resources that could substitute away the resources that are currently in place in the theme parks business. From this quick analysis, we may conclude that substantial cost of building the resources ourselves exist. So it might not be cheaper at all than an M&A. And in fact, we had earlier concluded that we might be okay with just using a non-equity alliance for entering that business. Hence, organic does not seem preferred over inorganic. More generally, we can look at the following questions to determine whether a resource is easy to copy, easy to catch up, or easy to substitute. The first question, are legal hurdles to copy the resource absent or present, has to do with patents and copyright. Sometimes the resource cannot be copied because of legal reasons. Think about a brand name. If I want to start up my own business with a Ferrari brand, that's not feasible because of legal reasons. Whereas a brand in principle would be easy to copy, I could simply copy the name. Other resources are much harder to copy because they haven't been codified or are really embedded into people. You can think about advanced R&D skills, for example. Then even if we want to copy the resource, it's unclear how we should be doing that. Catching up is typically easier to do if you have already resources that are related. So for Ferrari, it might be easier to enter a business of family cars rather than a business of theme parks, simply because they would have more related resources for the first business rather than the second business. Another important aspect is network effects. Network effects exist if the value of the resource increases the more number of people uses that resource. So for example, let's think about Facebook. Why are we all on Facebook? We are on Facebook because all our friends are on Facebook. And all our friends are on Facebook because all their friends are on Facebook. So you can see that there's a network or an amplification effect. The more people are on Facebook, the more other people are drawn to Facebook. It's for that reason that even Google a very dominant and powerful player, found it difficult to catch up with Facebook. They launched Google+, but basically people didn't migrate from Facebook to Google+, because the friends were on Facebook but not on Google+. So if network effects are present, it might be very difficult for you to catch up. The last issue, whether a resource is easy to substitute, has to do with whether you can use an other resource instead of the key resource. Let's think about a clothing company that has a very strong retail channel. It has branches all over the country. Now, it might be very difficult for us to imitate or even to catch up, but perhaps we could substitute it. One way would be if we go directly online. We sell directly to the customers without the need of those physical branches. In that way, we could substitute away the key resource. Thus, when considering organic versus inorganic growth, the synergies across the two might be quite similar because they both rely on full ownership. So what we're really doing here is comparing the cost of building up resources with the cost of acquiring or allying to access those resources. When considering diversification, an important insight that we had was that you cannot separate the question of how to diversify from the question of whether to diversify. And we saw that the 5-step approach was one way of combining these two questions. We've looked at these 5 steps. 1. Finding synergies. 2. Identifying resource gaps. 3. Identifying candidates. 4. Ally or acquire. 5. Organic or inorganic growth. We've applied this framework to Ferrari diversifying into ThemeSpark. Now, do you remember that I said this might be a bit far-fetched? Look at what you can visit in Abu Dhabi. This is Ferrari World. Ferrari World is the largest indoor theme park in the world. The theme park has roller coasters, it has a race simulator, it has shows, and you can even drive a Ferrari. Which growth mode did Ferrari apply? In line with our analysis, they found little synergies or benefits from jointly operating. In fact, Ferrari is just licensing its brand without much further involvement. So it hasn't built the theme parks and it is not running the ThemeSpark. On the face of it, this is a surprising move by Ferrari. But with the framework, we can actually make sense of their move. Now we've come to the last video for this week on diversification. I hope you feel empowered to take diversification decisions in your context in a structured way. Hi, welcome back. Last week we talked about diversification, which was entering a new business. This week we're going to look at the opposite. We're going to talk about exiting from a business, and that is called divestiture. Now, several questions come to mind when we think about divestiture. First, how can we decide whether we should divest? Second, from which particular business should you divest? And thirdly, what options do you have available when you want to divest? That is, what modes of divestiture can you choose from? Now, we're going to look at these questions together this week, and I'm going to take you through a series of steps that you can use to make a divestiture decision in your company. Now, first, I'd like to begin with some examples of divestiture. Toshiba is a Japanese company active in many businesses, including in consumer electronics, such as television, but also in medical equipment, and you see one of their products here. Recently, however, it sold its medical business, Toshiba Medical, to another Japanese multi-business firm, Canon. Thus, Toshiba exited a business, and that business continued under the ownership of Canon. Here's the next example, eBay and PayPal. eBay is perhaps best known for its online marketplace, where you can buy goods directly from other consumers. It used to have its own payment system, PayPal. You can use PayPal to pay on eBay, but also to pay on other websites. And you can also have a bank account with PayPal. Nowadays, you can still use PayPal on eBay, but eBay no longer owns PayPal. It has exited the payments business. This is the final example, Philips. Philips is a Dutch company that underwent a massive transformation in the last 2 decades, with Philips divesting several of its businesses. One of its oldest businesses is lighting. Even though it's one of the world's largest manufacturers of lighting, Philips has started divesting its lighting business. These are 3 examples of divestiture. The companies exited a business they were previously active in. Here's a general representation. A company is active in the footballs and footwear businesses. Then it decides to exit the footwear business. Here you can see that divestiture is the opposite of diversification. If you go from the situation on the left to the right, it's called divestiture. If you go from the situation on the right to the left, that is, you enter a new business, it's called diversification. You may have heard of something called outsourcing, which is another way to reduce the scope of the organization. Here's how outsourcing differs from divestiture. As before, a company is active in both the footballs and footwear business. Then it decides to outsource the manufacturing of footwear to another company. That is, someone else manufactures the footwear for the original company. The original company continues to design and sell footwear. It has not exited the business. Hence, this is not divestiture. Divestiture is when you exit the entire value chain. Outsourcing is when you exit only part of the value chain. We will look at divestiture, which is exiting from a business. Let's look at the different ways you can exit from a business. We've seen some examples of divestitures, but how can you divest? What options do you have available if you want to divest? The firms in our examples do it quite differently. Toshiba sold the medical business to Canon. This is called a sell-off. It's the opposite of an M&A. We say that Canon acquired the business and that Toshiba sold off the business. Next, eBay also exited the business, but it did not sell PayPal to another company. Instead, 2 independent companies were created. This is called a spin-off. In practical terms, if you had 1 share in the combined company, then after the transaction, you would have 1 share in eBay, and in addition, you would get a new share in PayPal. You could then decide whether to keep both shares, keep only 1 share, or sell both. Thus, in the previous example, the shares of the medical business went to another company, Canon. In this example, the shares went to the existing owners, or at least initially. Finally, Philips is taking a gradual process to exiting a business. It initially sold 25% of the lighting business to the general public by creating publicly traded shares in the lighting business. This is called an equity carve-out. As is typical in an equity carve-out, over time, Philips is selling most of its shares in lighting. Its stated objective is to fully sell down all its shares over the years to come. Here's an overview of the different ways to divest. Let's say you're running a firm active in 3 businesses, here shown on your left. You're considering divesting from the 3rd business. In a sell-off, another company would buy your business. Here, another company is the new owner of your business. In a spin-off, the business would become independent, with its shares going to the original shareholders. In an equity carve-out, the business initially remains part of the firm, with outside investors becoming part owner. Typically, over time, the original firm would sell all its shares in that business. In a split-up, shares are created in the underlying business, with those in the former parent discontinued. Thus, a split-up is like a spin-off, with the difference that the former parent no longer exists. If you want to divest, we now know which options you have available. We're going to focus on sell-offs and spin-offs. We're not going to focus on equity carve-outs and split-ups. The reason is that equity carve-outs often end up like spin-offs and sell-offs. Split-ups, on the other hand, they are implemented through equity carve-outs and spin-offs. So if we have a good understanding of spin-offs and sell-offs, we know quite well the main modes of divestiture. In the next video, we're going to look at when we should divest. We've seen what divestiture is. We've also seen how to divest, particularly spin-offs and sell-offs. Now we're going to look at when to divest. Let's say our firm is active in businesses A and B, and that we want to consider divesting business B. Then we should be comparing the current situation, A and B, with the new situation, only B. What does that look like? The current situation is the value of being in both businesses, here indicated by the value of A and B. The new situation is just the value of business A, here indicated by V of A. Of course, you would also hope to get something in return when divesting business B, and that's here indicated by D of B, the divestment of B, which is the value from divesting that business. If you do a sell-off, that is, sell your business to another company, then this would be the price for which that company pays for your business B. If you do a spin-off, that is, the shares of the divested business are distributed to the shareholders, then it's the value of business B as an independent divested business. For precision, here's a definition. It's not important to remember the notation. I do, however, want you to remember the basic trade-offs. We're comparing before with after. Before, we have the value of businesses A and B together. For the after situation, businesses A and B are no longer valued jointly, but separately. The value of A is here indicated by V of A. The value of B is indicated by the divested value, the D of B. You notice a little m. That means the value of the divestment for B depends on the divestiture mode. From this notation, we can derive the basic conditions for when we should divest versus when we should not divest. The first condition we recognize, synergies. Synergies means that the value of businesses A and B is greater if jointly operated rather than separately operated. If we think there are synergies, then that would be an argument for keeping these businesses together. However, if we believe there are no synergies, then that would be an argument for the businesses to be separate, that is, to divest a business. This first condition has to do with the V of A and B. The other condition is called better parent. This means that another owner can pay more for business B than what that business is worth to you. For example, this might happen if another company has even stronger synergies with business B than you do. If there's a better parent, then this by itself would be a reason for divesting business B. Note that this can happen even if business B is doing well and even if we have synergies with our business B. This condition has to do with the D of B. From these conditions, we can derive clear implications not only for when to divest, but also for the best divestiture mode. Let's start with the situations when there's no synergies and no better parent. There's no reason to keep the business, and at the same time, it's unclear whom we would sell the business to. So we can go for a spin-off. That is, we can make the business independent and distribute its shares among the original shareholders. Let's move to the opposite situation, when there are synergies and there is a better parent. We would be happy to hold on to the business because the business has synergies with our other businesses, yet there's another company that can create even more value from that business. In that case, we can go for a sell-off. That is, we sell the business to another company. Let's move to the third situation. No synergies and a better parent. Because there are no synergies, we can divest the business. A sell-off that is selling to another company is a natural option. In some circumstances, however, a spin-off could be preferred on financial grounds. This has to do with the price the other company is willing to pay, tax considerations, and the fee you would have to pay the advisors of the transaction. For us, what's important is that in this situation, you would consider a divestiture. Then the last situation, synergies and no better parent. This means there's value from jointly operating this business and no one can do better than us. However, as we've seen last week, the existence of synergies does not necessarily mean we should have full ownership. We discussed the trade-offs between alliances and acquisitions in terms of the benefits and costs of equity. Here the discussion is a similar one. We currently have full ownership, as in an acquisition, but perhaps more value can be realized if the business has some independence, as in an equity carve-out, or in full independence, as in a spin-off. You can use the ally or acquire framework that we saw last week to think through the optimal level of equity. We've looked at when to divest. I'd like to make two further points. First, we've seen that even if there are synergies, you may want to divest if there's a better parent out there. That means that for us as corporate strategists, we want to actively consider our portfolio. We want to actively consider which businesses should be in our portfolio and which businesses should not be in our portfolio, even if those businesses are doing well. The second point is that you may have noticed parallels between what we saw last week, diversification, and this week, divestiture. And the reason is that one is the opposite of the other. So we can reuse a lot of the material that we covered last week, diversification, for this week, divestiture. Up to now, we have taken an analytical approach towards divestitures. But these divestitures come with lots of emotion. And these emotions are very likely to differ across people. For example, whether you're a manager at the top of the organization versus an employee lower down in the organization. Or whether you're part of the business that's being divested versus being part of a business that remains. Or the emotion will differ versus an employee or a shareholder. Now, the emotions or feelings may not only differ across people, but may very well differ also across regions or cultures. I have a question for you. Let's imagine you're the CEO and you're forced to make a decision. You can either cut dividends or lay off employees. What would you do? A similar question was asked in research conducted among managers. However, instead of asking what they would do, the managers were asked which alternative would be chosen in their country. Here are the results. The choice differs heavily by country. On the one hand, respondents in Japan overwhelmingly indicated cut dividends. On the other hand, respondents in the UK and the US chose predominantly lay off employees. Germany and France were in between. This research was conducted 20 years ago. However, I asked the same question in my classes at UCL, and I'm fortunate to have an international audience. The results are the same. The choice the students make differs heavily by the country where they're currently living. So one reason why divestitures can become so contentious is that the outcomes differ across people. In addition, what you consider a fair outcome will depend on where you grew up. Thus, I cannot tell you what the right outcome is. I would like, however, to point out one thing. Let's look at the US, one of the countries most tilted towards keeping dividends for the shareholders. In the US, the fiduciary duty of the board, that is, the legal responsibility of its directors, is towards the organization as a whole, including employees, not just shareholders. Thus, even in the US, we cannot simply justify on legal grounds only that we need to retain dividends in order to maximize shareholder value, or that we need to divest a business purely on legal grounds. Divestitures involve tough decisions, and these decisions can be difficult not only because they're analytically complex, but also because outcomes will differ across people. And which outcomes are deemed acceptable will depend on the country where you operate. So far, we've seen the basic conditions for when to diversify. Lack of synergies or better parents. That is, other companies that can create more value with your business than you can. We've also seen how to divest. Most importantly, spin-offs and sell-offs. How can we combine these ideas so that you can apply them? Here's a three-step approach. These are the three practical steps. First, finding synergies. Second, identifying better parents. And lastly, choosing the divestiture mode. In the next set of videos, we're going to look at each step separately so that you can apply this approach to evaluate or recommend a divestiture move. The first step in the divestiture decision is finding synergies. Here we can apply everything we already learned about synergies. Last week we looked at what synergies are and how we can find them. If you want a refresher, I encourage you to go back to some of those videos. In this step, we're interested in finding out if there are synergies between the business that we may want to divest and the other businesses in our portfolio. If we find no synergies, then that could be a reason for divestiture. Here are the three steps in the divestiture decision. We are at the first step, finding synergies. To help us understand the divestiture decision, let's walk through an example. Tesco is a supermarket chain, and this particular store is in London. You see that there are two logos, one of Tesco and one of Harris & Hull, which is a coffee house chain owned by Tesco. Some of its coffee houses are within a Tesco store and others are not. If you were Tesco, would you divest Harris & Hull? The first question to answer is, what synergies, if any, does a supermarket have with a coffee house? Because we're looking at operational synergies, we'll start with the value chains. Here you see two value chains, one for the supermarket and another for the coffee house. You may notice that these are fairly basic value chains, but that's often a good starting point for gaining insights. There's really two big chunks in each value chain: opening a store and running a store. Opening a store includes identifying the best site for a store, real estate negotiations, and the design of the store itself. Does Tesco have any skills that would help Harris & Hull? Yes, I can imagine in identifying a site and real estate negotiations, Tesco has something to offer to a Harris & Hull. Probably not so much in the design of the actual store. Let's say we give synergies here a plus. What about the next step, procurement? Can Harris & Hull benefit from the scale of Tesco when buying coffee? Perhaps if they would use the same suppliers. Again, I'm going to put one plus here. Next is logistics. We could deliver products to Harris & Hull at the same time as delivering products to a Tesco store. The benefit depends on how many of the stores are in or near a Tesco store. I'm going to be a bit conservative here and I'm going to add between a 0 and a plus. Over to branding. The brand positioning of Harris & Hull and Tesco is quite different. Harris & Hull describes themselves as a chain of artisan coffee shops made up of experienced, passionate coffee lovers. In contrast, Tesco aims more for lower prices rather than higher quality. Indeed, their slogan is, "Every little helps." Thus, if anything, there might be negative synergies from combining these brands. For now, however, I'm just adding a 0 here. Finally, sales. To me, it would seem that the in-store sales is quite different. Selling a cup of coffee, personally made for a customer, in a nice environment, versus selling standardized groceries. But I'm no expert in the supermarket or coffee house business, so I could be wrong here. I'm going to add in between a 0 and a plus. Thus, we can identify some synergies across the value chain. To me, the strongest synergies would be in the first part, store opening. But we don't know how big these would be in absolute numbers. Thus, based on a quick analysis, we can say that synergies exist between a supermarket and a coffee house business. Based on this information, there's no need to divest the coffee house business. Now, because this is a quick analysis, it's also fairly subjective. That is, you could come up with different synergies, or you could question some of the synergies that we just come up with. That's okay for two reasons. First, a quick analysis can already generate some useful insight. And second, at this stage of the process, you want to start a discussion with your team. You don't want to finish or close off a discussion. Probably a discussion or an analysis joined between you and me will yield a better outcome than either your analysis or my analysis done on its own. There's two criteria for the divestiture decision. The first one, synergies, we've looked at in the previous video. This video, we look at the second condition, better parents. A better parent is someone who can pay more for the business than what it's worth to you. Now, a better parent can pay more simply because that company has a lot of money. We're actually more interested in the situation when a better parent can pay more for your business, not because it has a lot of money, but because it can create more value from a business than you can. Put differently, a better parent is someone who has more synergies with a business than you have. Thus, we're at step 2 of the divestiture decision, identifying better parents. Let's return to our example of Tesco, the supermarket, and Harris & Hull, the coffee house chain. Now we're looking for better parents. Where can we find them? In general, there are 3 groups that we can look for. First, companies already active in the coffee house business. That could be other coffee house chains. The second group is companies not yet active in the coffee house business. For example, we could look at other supermarkets. The third group is an interesting one. It's so-called financial buyers. These buyers are not necessarily interested in synergies, but they buy companies and then improve the financing structure of the company they bought. Here we're interested in synergies. We've already seen the synergies between a supermarket and a coffee house. Let's think about the synergies between a coffee house chain and another coffee house chain. In the last video, we said that synergies between a supermarket and a coffee house may exist in store opening, procurement, and possibly in sales and logistics, but less likely in branding. If we now think of linking the value chains of an established coffee house player with that of Harris & Hull, where would the synergies be? Let's start with store opening. Another coffee house could help in identifying a site and real estate negotiations. Unlike Tesco, the other coffee house could probably also help in the design of the store. So perhaps they can generate at least as much synergies. Then procurement. Another coffee house could also benefit from combining volumes, perhaps not just for coffee, but also, for example, for coffee machines. Thus possibly even more synergies than Tesco has. Next is logistics. Can we benefit from supplying the stores at the same time? Possibly. It depends on the location of the stores. I'm going to be a bit cautious here and assume somewhat less synergies than for the supermarket. Then branding. There's a potential for using the same brand across both coffee houses. If so, that would mean synergies. Finally, sales. It was not immediately clear what Tesco could bring to selling coffee, but here that's much clearer in terms of making coffee, selling coffee, training employees, and so on. So potentially substantial synergies. Thus, we can identify synergies across the value chain. But importantly, on balance, probably even more so than for the supermarket. If so, then we identified a better parent, another coffee house chain. Thus, we find synergies between the supermarket and the coffee house chain. But more importantly, we find perhaps even more synergies between Harris & Hull, the coffee house chain, and another coffee house chain. If that's true, then that suggests that Tesco is not the best parent for Harris & Hull, but there would be a better parent, another coffee house chain. In the next video, we'll look at the implications for divestiture. For now, I'd like to take a step back and point out the link between this video and a video that we saw in the first week on competition. Back then, we said that competition for a corporate strategist is anyone who can assemble a similar portfolio as you can. In this video, we see a clear implication. Even if your businesses are doing well, even if you are creating synergies between those businesses, then the competition is raising the bar for you about how much value you should create. If someone else can create as much value as you can, or perhaps can create even more value than you can, then the question arises whether you are the right parent for this business. The divestiture decision is based on two criteria. The first is the absence of synergies. The second is the presence of better parents. In this step, we combine both criteria and decide on a divestiture and the best mode of divestiture. We are at step 3, choosing divestiture mode. Just to recap, in our example of Tesco, the supermarket chain, and Harris & Hall, the coffee house, we have made two conclusions so far. First, synergies do exist between the supermarket and the coffee house. And second, probably even more synergies exist between the coffee house and another coffee house chain. This would suggest that Tesco is not the best parent, but another coffee house chain might be a better parent. Where does that leave us? We are in this situation. Synergies, yes. And better parent, yes. Thus for Tesco, it could make sense to have a coffee house chain in its portfolio of businesses, but it might make even more sense for someone else. Hence, we could consider a divestiture only if we can sell off the business to someone else who can create more value. A sell-off. Here we've seen an instance of a business that does well within a multi-business firm. But that business might do even better with another firm. That then would suggest that divestiture is a good option. More generally, we have seen a 3-step approach that we can use to recommend or evaluate a divestiture in a structured way. This week we looked at divestitures, reducing the number of businesses you're active in. In particular, we looked at a 3-step approach that you can use to evaluate or recommend a divestiture. Step 1 is finding synergies. Step 2 is identifying better parents. And then using the inputs of step 1 and 2 to decide on the divestiture mode in step 3. To illustrate this approach, we consider Tesco and its coffee house chain, Harris & Hall. Now, did Tesco divest its coffee house chain? And if so, how? I went out to investigate. The answer is yes. Tesco sold Harris & Hall to Caffè Nero, which is a coffee house chain with over 800 cafes in 8 countries. So far, Harris & Hall has kept its own brand. So Caffè Nero probably bought Harris & Hall for synergies other than branding. Using our analysis, we can understand this strategic move by Tesco. Perhaps there are synergies between Tesco and Harris & Hall, but likely there are even more synergies between Harris & Hall and Caffè Nero. If so, then divesting through a sell-off is a good option. This was the last video of this week. I hope to see you next week. Hi, welcome back. In week 1, we established that corporate strategy really is about 2 things. First of all, portfolio selection. Which businesses should you be active in? Then in week 2, we looked at one particular instance of that, diversification, that is, entering new businesses. In week 3, we continued our discussion of portfolio selection by looking at divestiture, exiting from a business. So corporate strategy is about portfolio selection, but it's also about portfolio organization. How should you organize to create value across your businesses? And in this week, we're going to look at an important instance of that, the role of corporate headquarters. Now, corporate headquarters is important to us because that's where corporate strategy is made, but also they are ultimately responsible for ensuring corporate advantage. How can you create more value from businesses through joint ownership? Let's look at an example. This is a simplified structure of Sony, a Japanese company. Sony is active in many businesses, which it has clustered in three groups: electronics, entertainment, for example, movies, and financial services. They have a business called Sony Bank. Headquarters is where corporate strategy is made. Oftentimes in the headquarters, you also find corporate management functions, including treasury, risk management, taxation, financial reporting, company secretary and legal counsel, government relations, and investor relations. These are often referred to as obligatory functions, as they relate to the reporting of financial, tax, and legal data. Shared services are activities that could have been done at each level of the business, but to benefit from scale are instead done centrally. At Sony, these include marketing and R&D. These shared services are tightly linked to headquarters because headquarters is organizationally responsible for these services and might be in the same physical location. Thus, corporate headquarters sits on top of the businesses and is responsible for corporate strategy. That is the strategy that cuts across all businesses. In the last video, we saw that corporate headquarters controls the businesses. But who controls corporate headquarters? Here's data from a study into corporate control around the world. This figure shows the control of the largest 20 public firms for each country. A public firm means that the shares of that firm are traded on a public exchange so that you and I can buy and sell them. This study looks at whether these firms have a large shareholder, which is defined here as someone having at least 20% control. If there's no single shareholder with at least 20% control, a firm is classified as widely held. If there's at least one shareholder with at least 20% control, a firm is classified based on its biggest shareholder. Family, if that shareholder is an individual. State, if that shareholder is a government. Firm, if that shareholder is another firm. There's also a category other if none of the categories applies. What do we see? Widely held is the biggest group, but we also see lots of variation across countries. Some countries almost all, other countries almost none. Across the 27 countries from all over the world, 36% are widely held, 30% family, and 18% state. I'd like to point out two things. First, many of these large firms have at least one important controlling shareholder. Thus, who controls corporate headquarters? Well, in many instances, there are at least one or a few big shareholders with an important say. Second, who are these big shareholders? Well, oftentimes that's an individual or an individual part of a family. Now, for the largest firms, these families are often well known, at least nationally. Let's look at some examples. The Agnellis from Italy are behind Fiat, the automotive company. The Lee family is a controlling shareholder in Samsung. Tata in India is controlled by the Tata family. And in the USA, the Walton family has a big stake in Walmart, the company they founded and now the world's largest company by revenue. The data I have shown you is from large and public firms. Now, I expect the percentage of family control to be even larger if we were to look not at large firms, but at small firms, and if we were not to look at public, but at private firms. Thus, the 30% family control that we found in this sample is probably a lower bound. I'd like to expand a little bit on the distinction between public and private. For a single business firm, that distinction is immediately clear. For a multi-business firm, there's some interesting combinations. Sometimes you can buy shares in the parent company, the legal entity that owns and operates the businesses. Or you can buy shares in the businesses themselves. This gives the following combinations. Let's start with private-private. For Aldi, a German supermarket chain, you can buy shares neither in the parent company nor in the businesses. That's why it's called private-private. In contrast, L'Oréal, a French cosmetics company, you can buy shares of the parent company, but not in one of the businesses. So the choice you have is to either buy the bundle of businesses or none of the businesses at all. You cannot pick and choose. Bharti Enterprises, an Indian multi-business firm, is the opposite. You cannot buy shares in the parent company. However, you do have the opportunity to buy shares in some of its underlying businesses. For example, you could buy shares in Bharti Airtel, which is one of its businesses and is a telecom player. You could also buy shares in Bharti Infratel, another business which makes telecom tower infrastructure and is also public. The last category is that both the parent and the businesses are public. Fewer companies are in this category, but they do exist. One of them is Ayala from the Philippines, and you can buy shares in the parent company, and you can also buy shares in some of its businesses, including Ayala Land, a real estate business, and Manila Water, a water provider. But who controls corporate headquarters? We've seen that oftentimes there's one or a few big shareholders. And those important shareholders are oftentimes part of a family. So if we look at a multi-business firm and think of it as widely held, then that's correct for some firms. But oftentimes family firms or multi-business firms are controlled by a family. In the last video, we looked at who controls corporate headquarters. And we saw that oftentimes there's one or a few big shareholders with substantial control. And secondly, we saw that oftentimes these shareholders are part of a family. Now the question is, how can few families control so much? And that's the question we're going to address in this video. And in particular, we're going to look at two ways in which they achieve such substantial control. On the one hand, shares with extra voting rights and pyramids. Here's an example. A family has a firm to hold its investments, here called a family firm. Then you have a parent company that owns several businesses. One of them is shown here. In terms of ownership, the family owns 100% of the family firm. That family firm owns 80% of the parent company, meaning that the remaining 20% of the parent company is owned by other players. In turn, the parent company owns 40% of the business. Now the question is, how much of the business does the family own? The parent company owns 40% of the shares of the business, and the family firm owns 80% of the parent company. Using these figures, we can then calculate the percentage of shares owned. That is 80% times 40% equals 32%. This means that the family is entitled to 32% of the dividends. The first way a family can increase its control is through shares with more voting rights. A share has two types of rights. The first is cash flow rights. That means you're entitled to a share of the profits. At the end of every year, you get your dividends. The other right is voting rights. That is, you're entitled to vote on important matters, including the selection of board members or the approval of an acquisition. Now, families oftentimes have shares with more voting rights than other shareholders. Let's say that the numbers here represent the cash flow rights or the dividends. Now let's say that the parent company has 40% of the shares, but those shares give them 60% of the voting rights. What percentage of the votes of the business does the family own? We can use a similar calculation with these new numbers. That is 80% times 60% equals 48%. This means that the family owns 48% of the votes of the business. Thus, the votes owned is substantially above the shares owned. The second way a family can increase its control of the businesses is by adopting a pyramid structure. That is a structure by which the ownership of a business goes through a chain of companies. And that's the ownership structure we've seen here. The family does not have a direct stake in the business, rather its stake is indirect and goes through another company. In this case, it goes through the parent firm. Now, what's the consequence? Well, we've calculated the percentage of votes owned as 48%. But what percent of the vote does the family actually control? One way of looking at it is as follows. If it comes to a vote at the parent company, who dominates that vote? Well, the family firm has 80% of the votes, thus they can almost dictate what they want. Thus, while they own 48% of the votes in the business, they can control all the votes that the parent company has. That is, they can control all 60%. Thus, we can say that they own 48%, but control 60% of the votes. Hence, we started off with the family and 32% of the shares owned. That went up to 48% of the votes owned through voting rights. And that went up to 60% through the pyramid structure. They control much more than they own. Thus, we have seen two ways through which you can control more than you own. The first is shares with extra voting rights. The second is pyramids, indirect ownership through other companies. We've looked at who controls corporate headquarters, and in particular, we focused on the role of families and their usage of pyramids and voting rights to control more than they own. Now the question is, how can corporate headquarters control the separate businesses? In this video, we're going to look at 4 different ways that corporate headquarters can influence the underlying businesses. We can think of headquarters influence models along 2 dimensions. First, the nature of the relationship between the businesses in the portfolio. On the one hand, standalone, the headquarters does not encourage any meaningful relationship between the different businesses in the portfolio. Headquarters influence is felt solely through the direct relationship between headquarters and the businesses. The basic idea is that the businesses independently benefit from a valuable resource located at headquarters. On the other hand, linkage. The headquarters encourages businesses to work closely together. Headquarter influence is felt through the relationship between businesses that are encouraged or administered under the supervision of headquarters. The second dimension of HQ influence is the nature of the relationship between headquarters and the businesses. Directive control is when headquarters is heavily involved in the strategic decisions of the businesses, for example by approving, vetoing, or ordering such decisions. In contrast, evaluative control is when HQ lets the responsibility for the strategic decisions with the businesses, but it would evaluate those decisions afterwards through monitoring of outcomes and financial targets. Directive control is more steering on behavior, and evaluative control is more steering on outcomes. These 2 dimensions lead to 4 different HQ influence models. Of course, many intermediate points exist, but for us it's useful to start with a small set of influence models. Let's look at an example of each of them. Virgin is active in many businesses, including in airlines, telecommunications, and banking. The key resource is its brand, which is carefully maintained at headquarters, and there's no push towards strong relationships between the businesses. The businesses themselves can decide on their own actions. Thus, the HQ influence model is standalone evaluative. Danaher is active in multiple businesses: dental, life sciences, and diagnostics. Like Virgin, Danaher keeps its businesses independent from each other. But the involvement of HQ is much more direct. In particular, they look for businesses that will benefit from what they call the Danaher business system, which is a lean manufacturing system. So the idea is that HQ helps to improve the performance of the businesses through direct intervention. The HQ influence model is standalone directive. Tata is active in many businesses, including cars, IT, and hotels. It might be difficult for Tata to adopt a directive control for 2 reasons. First, the businesses are very diverse, so it's difficult for headquarters to have in-depth knowledge about all businesses and to suggest strategic decisions for each of them. Second, it does not fully own or control many of its businesses. Instead, Tata promotes internal alliances between the businesses. This model is linkage evaluative. Lastly, Sony is keen to foster deep relationships between the businesses, for example, by clustering related businesses. Furthermore, HQ takes a directive approach towards the businesses. For example, they provide input on the technological direction. This model is linkage directive. Thus HQ can take quite different approaches towards influencing its businesses. Now, the most suitable approach will depend on the key resources and the synergies that can be shared across the portfolio of businesses. Every year, corporate headquarters must decide how to spread its investments across the portfolio of businesses. Now, regardless of HQ influence model, resource allocation is the most important tool headquarters has to influence the businesses. In the next set of videos, we're going to look at several different perspectives on resource allocation, and the goal is for you to have a broad understanding of resource allocation to help you find a suitable resource allocation for your company. In this video, we'll cover the financial perspective. Let's say we're in the corporate headquarters of Chimera, which is a multi-business firm active in 3 businesses: beauty, health, and home. We have a budget available of 100. Each business has put in their request to corporate headquarters. It turns out that for next year, each business would like to make investments of 60. We've calculated the value of each of these investments, and they're indicated here under NPV, which is the net present value. You can think of that as how much those investments are worth over the lifetime of those investments, taking into account how much we put in and how much we get out. Given these requests, how would you allocate your budget across these businesses? These are all NPV positive projects, meaning we get more back than we put in. So if we had an unlimited budget, we would fund all requests. We don't have an unlimited budget. To fund all, we would need 3 times 60, which is 180, and that is more than the 100 we have. What should we do? One way is to fund the investments with the highest returns. In this case, the beauty business has the highest return, so we could give them the requested 60. That leaves 40. What next? Well, comparing health and home, we see that if each were funded 60, then home would have a higher return. We could make an assumption that if we fund each 40, then home would still have a higher return than health. If so, then we would allocate the remaining 40 to home, with nothing left for health. The financial perspective is quite intuitive. We give more funding to businesses with higher returns, and we give less funding to businesses with lower returns. Next up is the uncertainty perspective. The financial perspective suggests that we should give more to businesses with high returns and less to businesses with lower returns. That makes a lot of sense. In this video, I introduce uncertainty. Here is almost the same situation as before. You're at corporate headquarters and your budget for next year is 100. The businesses have put in their requests, and each would like to get 60. We see that beauty would have a return of 25 and health a return of 5. The only difference is that this time we don't know what the return on the investments would be for home. In this situation, how would you allocate your 100 across the different businesses. If we had only beauty and health, we would give more to beauty than to health because beauty's returns are better. But we also have home, and now it gets difficult. Should we invest something in home or nothing at all? This is a common problem. We're deciding on investments where some of the costs are known upfront, but the returns in the future are uncertain. And perhaps the only way of finding out about those returns is to make an investment. Perhaps a small one, but an investment nonetheless. This is a classic trade-off between making investments in businesses that we know well and are closely related to our current portfolio, and perhaps we have a good sense of what the returns would be, which is called exploitation, versus investments in businesses that we don't know so well. The future returns are uncertain, but those businesses may turn out to be the next big win. Exploration. This trade-off underlies many models of resource allocation. Probably the most well-known is the BCG matrix from the Boston Consulting Group. The matrix allocates businesses based on their market share and market growth. And the basic advice is that you need a balanced portfolio. You want the stars because they have high growth and you're well positioned. You need cash cows to give you funding for future growth. And in particular, you want to use that money from the cash cows to invest in question marks to ensure your growth is satisfied for the future. Only dogs are not needed. Thus, a key idea is that you want to invest now in some businesses that will give you high returns in the future. You don't want to put all your money in new ideas, but at the same time, you need to put down some of your money because growth requires exploration. Let's go back to our example. The NPV of beauty is higher than that of health. So we fund beauty more than health. The returns of the home business are uncertain. Does that mean we should not fund that business at all? The key trade-off is between exploitation, milking existing opportunities, versus exploration, investing in new growth opportunities. Now, if beauty and health still have a lot of growth, you're less keen to want to invest in the uncertain outcomes of home. In contrast, if beauty and health are running low on growth, you're more likely or more keen to invest in the uncertain outcomes of home. We've seen the financial perspective and we've seen the uncertainty perspective. In this video, we'll look at the synergy perspective. Let's go back to our earlier example. We're still looking at our 3 businesses. Each would like to get 60, but in total we have only 100 available. This time, the return, or the NPV, for beauty depends not only on how much it gets, but also on how much health gets. If we give beauty 60 and nothing to health, the NPV for beauty is 0. If we give 60 to beauty and at least 10 to health, the NPV for beauty is 25. In other words, synergies exist between beauty and health. How should we allocate our resources? The 25 NPV for beauty is by far the highest, even higher than the NPVs for health and home combined. What do we need to do to capture the 25 NPV for beauty? 2 things. We need to invest 60 in beauty, and at least 10 in health. What do we do with the remainder? We need to make an assumption where the remaining 30 has the higher return. If we fund each with 60, then home has the higher return. Perhaps then we'll get the highest return if we allocate the remaining 30 to home. The key point here is that now we would give at least something to health, whereas in the absence of synergies, health would get nothing, as we discussed in the video on the financial perspective. Thus, synergies matter in resource allocation. We've seen the importance of synergies for corporate strategy and in particular for corporate advantage. Now again here, we see the importance of synergies for resource allocation. Now what's surprising is that synergies are absent from the main frameworks on resource allocation. For example, let's go back to the BCG matrix. There, an investment in one business did not affect the value or returns of another business. Moreover, the classification of the businesses in that framework relied on concepts of business strategy, that is, industry attractiveness and competitive advantage within that industry. But that classification did not reveal the synergies between the businesses. Now, if we want to aim for not competitive but corporate advantage, we need to take into account the synergies between the businesses. With my co-author Vanneste Puranam, we sought to address this issue by building our own framework. We call it the Synergistic Portfolio Framework. And the key idea is in the title. We analyze a portfolio not as independent businesses, but as businesses that may have synergies with each other. The two axes are incoming benefit and outgoing benefit. Incoming benefit is how much does this business gain or lose from belonging to this portfolio. Outgoing benefit is how much do the other businesses gain or lose from the presence of this business. Thus, if you are a business, then incoming benefit is how much you benefit, outgoing benefit is how much others benefit. Synergies for a business is the sum of the incoming and outgoing benefit. If the business is above the diagonal, then synergies are positive. If the business is below the diagonal, then synergies are negative. We can distinguish 6 categories. Fits. The business benefits and the rest of the portfolio benefits as well. Misfits is the opposite. No one benefits. Givers and altruists are businesses that don't benefit from the portfolio, but the portfolio does benefit from them. In the case of givers, the benefit outweighs the cost. In the case of altruists, the benefit does not outweigh the cost. And lastly, takers and parasites are businesses that benefit from the portfolio, but the portfolio does not benefit from them. In the case of takers, the benefit is greater than the cost, and in the case of parasites, the benefit is less than the cost. If you want corporate advantage, then invest in businesses above the diagonal, givers, fits, and takers, and not invest in businesses below the line, altruists, misfits, and parasites. How can we find for each business the incoming and outgoing benefit? Well, one way is to compare the current situation with the situation where we would divest the business through a spin-off. That is, we would make the business independent while leaving the rest of the portfolio as is. We can calculate the incoming benefit as the value of the business before spin-off minus the value after spin-off. Let's say for business A, we estimate its value as part of the portfolio as 150, and if spun off, only 100. then the incoming benefit is 150 minus 100 is 50. We can do the same calculations for businesses B and C. For B, that yields 180 minus 160 equals 20. For C, that gives 110 minus 160 equals minus 50. Thus, A and B have incoming benefits, C has incoming costs. The outgoing benefit is the value of the rest of the portfolio before spin-off minus the value after spin-off. Let's say if business A is part of the portfolio, then the rest of the portfolio is worth 830, whereas without business A, it would be only 600. Hence, the difference is 230. Similarly, for B, we would have an outgoing benefit of 800 minus 810, which is minus 10. For C, that gives 870 minus 890 equals minus 20. Thus, A has outgoing benefits, B and C have outgoing costs. The last step is to classify. A is a fit because both incoming and outgoing benefits are positive. B is a taker because the incoming benefit is greater than the outgoing cost. C is a misfit because it has both incoming and outgoing costs. Thus, based on this classification, we would be keen to invest in A and B, but not in C. If our corporate strategy is based on synergies, then synergies should be central in our resource allocation. Now, the synergistic portfolio framework can help you keep track of businesses with synergies and those without synergies. So far, we've seen three perspectives on resource allocation: financial, uncertainty, and synergy. In this video, we cover the last perspective, social. Let's go back to our example. 3 businesses that each want 60, but you only have 100 in total to allocate. Using the financial perspective, we said, let's give most to the businesses with the highest returns, or NPVs, and least to businesses with the lowest NPVs. In the earlier video, we proposed an allocation of 60-0-40. If you are at corporate headquarters, then this allocation looks like a great allocation. Now, what if you're the head of health, which got nothing? Would you still think this is a great allocation? If I were the head of health, I wouldn't like it. Beauty asked for 60, got 60. I asked for 60, got nothing. That would seem unfair to me. Now, what's the consequence if I or you would feel the allocation is unfair? Well, one consequence could be that we lose our motivation, and as a result, the performance of our business could suffer. Now, let's update our example and see what the consequences are for this social effect. The NPVs are as before, with one twist. Whenever a business gets less than 20, the business suffers and the NPV becomes minus 10. Let's say you are at corporate headquarters. How would you now allocate the resources? Let's say we begin by giving everyone 20.
That leaves us with 40. We can give the remainder to the business with the highest return, in this case, beauty. Thus, our allocation would be 60, 20, 20. Concerns for fairness lead to a different outcome than just looking at the highest NPV. It's important to remember that we're investing in people, not just projects. People have feelings and will react to allocations that are deemed unfair. Now, you may care about the feelings of people in their own right, or perhaps you don't care. Now, even putting aside these considerations, it's important to realize that many successful corporate strategies rely on collaboration. Collaboration between the businesses or collaboration between headquarters and the businesses. Now, such collaboration is hard to pull off when people feel unfairly treated. If we look at actual resource allocations in companies, one finding is relevant here. There's a tendency towards equal allocation. That is, businesses within the same multi-business firm get investments that are more similar to each other than to otherwise comparable businesses not part of a multi-business firm. Adopting a social perspective, we can understand why. We care not only about how much we get, but we also care about how much we get in relation to others. We've seen 4 perspectives on resource allocation: financial, uncertainty, synergy, and social. Now, how can you use these different perspectives to better allocate resources across your businesses? We're going to integrate these perspectives using the synergistic portfolio framework. The first is the financial perspective. And the guidelines are as follows. If your business has high returns, invest more. If your business has bad returns, invest less. Now, this perspective is the baseline. If we want our business to do well or even survive over the next few years, we have no choice but to follow these guidelines. The second perspective is synergies. If the goal is to achieve corporate advantage, and corporate advantage is based on synergies, then synergies need to be central when allocating resources. We can use the synergistic portfolio framework. Plot each business based on the incoming benefit, how much a business benefits from the portfolio, and on the outgoing benefit, how much the portfolio benefits from the business. One way to obtain these benefits, or an estimate of these benefits, is to look at the difference between the current value and what the value would be after spin-off. The guidelines are as follows. Invest in businesses above the line, don't invest in businesses below the line. The link with the financial perspective is as follows. In the financial perspective, we prioritize good over bad businesses. And there, good and bad are defined on a standalone basis. Here, we still prioritize good over bad businesses. But instead, good and bad are defined on the basis of benefits from and contributions to the portfolio. Thus, a business with a weak return could have a place in the portfolio as long as it generates substantial value for other businesses in the portfolio. Such a weak performing business has no place in a single business firm, but could have a place in a multi-business firm. The third perspective is uncertainty. Resource allocation is based on synergies. It's not always easy to estimate the synergies in the current portfolio. It's even harder to estimate the future synergies with new businesses or new growth opportunities. Oftentimes, the only way to get an estimate of what those future synergies are or will be is to make some investment. Perhaps a small one, but an investment nonetheless. Thus, in order to prepare for future growth, we'd like to explore at this moment. But how much should we explore? We can think of the exploitation versus exploration trade-off as follows. If we move the diagonal towards the top right, then we're getting a more focused portfolio. That is more exploitation. If we move the diagonal in the opposite direction, that is towards the bottom left, then we're getting a less focused portfolio. That is more exploration. Just to clarify, it's not that we're aiming for a more or less focused portfolio. We always want the portfolio with synergies. It's just that it's uncertain where the synergies will come from in the future. And in some situations, we will be more willing to take risks and explore, and in other situations, we will be less willing to take risks and prefer to exploit. What are those situations? We would lower the threshold if there's limited growth potential in the current portfolio. Most, if not all businesses, will die at some point. Thus, we need to plan for future growth now. We would choose a high threshold in the opposite situation, if the current portfolio still has sufficient growth potential. These implications mirror the insight from the BCG matrix, where the key idea was that you need a balanced portfolio in terms of growth opportunities. By moving the threshold, you can be more or less aggressive with the uncertain growth opportunities. The last perspective is the social perspective. Synergies are based on joint operations, thus parties need to be motivated to contribute. Of those that receive investments, givers, fits, and takers, who's most likely to be demotivated? Perhaps givers. They are valuable to the organization, but may not feel they benefit themselves sufficiently. Thus, when allocating resources, perhaps start with the givers and only lastly go to the takers. Resource allocation is the most important way corporate headquarters can influence the businesses. As we've seen, it's also quite complex. Now, this synergistic portfolio framework is one way for you to keep track of the different perspectives and the different arguments. We've come to the end of this course. This is the last video. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you on successfully completing this course. I hope you now feel ready to make corporate strategy decisions. Secondly, I'd like to sincerely thank you for all the hard work that you've put into completing this course. I wish you the very best for the future. Take care.